And so, I mean, people say things that are reprehensible all the time, but we can't always agree on what they are. But to start to criminalize that's hypothetical.
Are you saying nothing that anybody says should ever be counted as a crime? Racist
well, there's incitement to crime. That should be counted as a crime and has been for a very long time in the British common law tradition. But other than that, you should be very careful about what you regulate as speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define hate? That's the real issue. It's not that there's not hate. There's plenty of it. The question is who defines hate and how is it prosecuted?
I'm not frightened of forthright speech. I'm quite a forthright speaker myself. But when you talk about who's going to define hate, you want to see the letters and emails I see day after day and tell me that's not hate.
I didn't wait a second. Now, hang on a second.
No, yes.
Okay.
There was somebody fined under the Communications Act earlier this year because he posed a video on YouTube of a dog doing a kind of Nazi salute and he shouted in the background, "Gas the Jews." And that was, he was fined, it was a criminal prosecution. Is that right in your view?
I didn't think that was right, no. I think it was a big mistake. I mean, I followed that case fairly carefully, and you don't have to agree that what he did was comical or right, but to prosecute him criminally was a big mistake, and you're going to pay for it in this country.
Today, we have to stop there, I think. Dianne, briefly, just on that.
I would say that type of video with somebody shouting "kill the Jews" is an incitement to racial hatred, and now that's a crime.
Please. Fundamental British value, which is undermined by so-called safe spaces in our universities, where a sense of righteous entitlement by a minority of students that means that their wish not to be offended shuts down debate. As students around the country return to their places of learning at the start of this new academic year, does my right honourable friend agree that university is precisely the place for lively debate and that fear of being offended must not trump freedom of speech?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. We want our universities not just to be places of learning, but to be places where there can be open debate, which is challenged, and people can get involved in that. And I think everybody is finding this concept of safe spaces quite extraordinary, frankly. We want to see that innovation of thought taking place in our universities. That's how we develop as a country, as a society, and as an economy, and I absolutely agree with my honourable friend.
First of all, I mean, the reason for doing this, John, I mean, you talk about tolerance and intolerance. I mean, there are people out there, sadly, who are seeking to divide us. We are a government of one nation. We want to bring people together to ensure we are living together as one society. But there are those who are trying to promote hatred and intolerance, seeking to divide us into a them and us and undermine our British values. And what we are proposing is a bill which will have certain measures within it, measures such as introducing banning orders for groups and disruption orders for individuals, for those who are out there actively trying to promote this hatred and intolerance, which can lead to division in our society and undermines our British values. But it will be part of a bigger picture, a strategy which will also have as a key part of it actually promoting our British values, our values of democracy, rule of law, tolerance and understanding, acceptance of different faiths.
And freedom of speech, an essential prerequisite of a tolerant and decent society. And if you ban groups of people from getting together and talking about the things that worry them about the way our society is heading, don't you become a part of it?
No, well, first of all, I would say that your description of what we're proposing to do is not right.
Well, you're talking about banning certain groups of people getting together.
We're not talking about banning groups of people getting together who are simply talking about problems in society or what they perceive as issues that need to be addressed.
So when do they step over the edge?
We are talking about the extremism of all sorts, Islamist extremism, but also other forms of extremism like neo-Nazism, that is seeking to promote hatred, that is seeking to divide our society, that is seeking to undermine the very values that make us a great country to live in, that make us this great pluralistic society.
And how do you divide a society then? Let's assume, for instance, that a group of people put together a meeting at which they expressed views about homosexuality that you or I might perhaps find repugnant. Would they be dividing society?
What we're talking about here is an extremism that has an impact, that is divisive, that is trying to undermine our values.
Well, that would be divisive, wouldn't it?
That is trying to undermine our values. But the reason that we're doing this is, first of all, because we do need, I think, to ensure that we are together as one society, we are one nation, we are working
Speaking
to
with
ensure
one
that
voice?
well, there will be different views within that nation. Of course there will be different views.
Indeed.
And nobody is suggesting that different views cannot be expressed. But one of the reasons for looking at this issue of extremism is the path down which it can lead people.
The heart of this bill is actually three amendments, but two primarily, 168 and 169, that came in from the other place, that fundamentally attack the freedom of the press. There is widespread agreement on the need to regulate the digital economy and the ownership of data effectively. There's cross-party agreement on it, and I doubt there will be a division this evening. But the freedom of the press and freedom of speech are absolutely at the heart of our democracy. And members of Parliament should remember that this freedom will be exercised in a way that does not always provide hagiographies for us. Quite understandably, newspapers will say critical things of people on these benches and people on those benches. Sometimes they will be fair, sometimes they will be unfair. Sometimes we will read it and think that we have made a mistake. Sometimes we will read it and know that the newspaper has made a mistake. But that is the flotsam and jetsam of political life. For every piece in the Daily Mail that upsets members opposite, there will be something in the Daily Mirror that upsets us, or in the Guardian. And that is how political life works. And we surely are not sufficiently of the snowflake generation. But we should mind about that. That is how political life must and should go. And then we look at clause 168 and 169. And we know from our history that one of the tactics of dictatorial regimes is to have punitive damages levied on newspapers that do not do what they want. To have a system where if you lose a libel action, you are effectively closed down. Why do they do that? They do that so they can have the pretense of freedom of speech with the reality of control. We know from our own history that in the 18th and in the 19th century, libel laws were used to prevent the press from exercising the freedom that we think of as a constitutional birthright. We know that the Americans, when writing the Bill of Rights to their Constitution, made the Second Amendment a very clear statement of freedom of speech. Why? Because it was in response to the abuses that they thought were taking place in the United Kingdom at that point. They put it in because they're worried about things like the persecution of John Wilkes and his being sentenced to prison, not for what he did, but for what he said. And we see that being restored in clauses 168 and 169. The outrageous, the monstrous idea that if you print something that is entirely accurate, every dot and comma is true, but you have not bended the knee to officialdom, your fine will be to pay your own costs and the costs of the party about whom you will tell the truth. You have told the truth. The honourable gentleman, the member for Keighley, referred to the Daily Mail and the Lawrence affair. The Lawrence affair, the Daily Mail, that terrifying right-wing newspaper, which I read every day and enjoy, exposed the murderers of Stephen Lawrence in a way that required them to say things about the murderers that, until double jeopardy laws were changed, could never be proved in a court. What if this law had existed then? And those people we now know were guilty of murder had sued the Daily Mail for saying something that was true and had had to pay the costs of murderers. That is what their noble lordships have put in to this bill. But it is more serious on a day-to-day basis than the worst case that I can think of. We know the weakness of our local papers. We know how they struggle hand to mouth. But dare I say, how easy would it be for any one of us, my honourable friend, the member for Leinster, for example, who's not in his place anymore, to take to court the journal that he doesn't like because it said things about him that aren't accurate? And that's fair enough for him not to like them. But if an honourable member took a local paper to court, that local paper would be insolvent. Because many of them don't have powerful parents behind them. Many of them, and I think of some in my own constituency, are run by entrepreneurial individuals trying to make a reasonable living. And the threat that they would have to pay double costs would be sufficient to stop them printing that story that was disagreeable about us. Well, that's great. That means that in all Conservative seats, no disagreeable things will be published about Conservatives, and all Labour seats, the same will be true. And therefore, I remain the representative for North East Somerset forever and ever, amen, amen, alleluia, and the honourable gentleman for Keighley remains in Keighley likewise. But as it happens, both of us think this is fundamentally wrong and an attack on democracy. Free speech is not there so that Rupert Murdoch, a man I greatly admire, can make a great deal of money. It's not there so that the noble Lord Rothermere, can likewise make a decent living. It's there because it is the pillar of democracy. And if we do not have it, how can you expose corrupt governments, incompetent politicians, and dare I say it, there are some occasionally, governments that make mistakes? How do you expose that? Councils that get things wrong, errors that are made, dishonesties that are performed. Where are these going to go? How are these going to be reported if every one of us can shut down our local newspaper just by saying that we will go to court and they will have double costs? Now, the proponents of these two clauses will say that's all very well, but there's impress. But what is the fundamental principle that has prevented newspapers signing up to impress? A principle that I was one of 13 MPs who voted against the bill allowing this to happen, and feel that I was absolutely right to do so. A principle that a free press is one that cannot be regulated by the state. And the application to be approved by a regulator, approved by a royal charter, is regulation by the state. And it is not comparable with the judges or other organs of the state that are independent, because the judges are part of the state.
Go through an initial assessment and put the case in its proper category. And the categories that we've drawn up are these. One, cases where the communication constitutes a credible threat or violence to person or property. So, category 2 are communications which specifically target an individual and which may constitute harassment or a campaign of harassment under the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. The third is communications which may amount to a breach of a court order. And then the fourth category is communications which don't fall into categories 1, 2, 3, and which may be considered grossly offensive, indecent, obscene, or false. And so in the guidelines, we've said to get over the high threshold for prosecution for this fourth category, prosecutors have to be satisfied that the communication in question is more than offensive, shocking, or disturbing, satirical or rude, or the expression of an unpopular or unfashionable opinion about serious or trivial matters, or banter or humour, even if distasteful to some or painful to others. There's got to be something more than that to get over the high threshold. And then, so far as the public interest is concerned, we've indicated to prosecutors that each case must obviously be decided on its own facts and merits, but a prosecution is unlikely to be necessary where, one, the suspect has swiftly taken action to remove the communication or express genuine remorse. One of the features of the cases we've looked at is that in many cases the individual realises they've overstepped the mark and removes the communication pretty swiftly. Or prosecution unlikely to be in the public interest, where swift and effective action has been taken by others, for example, service providers, to remove the communication in question or otherwise block access to it. The old 1935 offence does apply to any message sent by an electronic communication system. So all of your emails, even if it's just to one other person, are caught by the Act. And there is obviously the potential there for people to send something to one person or two people, and it then gets sent on or included in a trail or such other way of reaching many, many more people. And we also worked out through the cases we were seeing that it did make a difference whether you actually were trying to reach the subject matter. So the difference really, I suppose, virtually of going into a cafe or bar and having a good old gossip about someone who isn't there, and saying it to their face. But broadly speaking, if you're in your own living room and you've got two chairs and you're talking to your pal, you can be pretty offensive, or really, really offensive actually, without breaking the criminal law. If you sat in the same two chairs and emailed each other, or sent each other texts, or Facebooked each other, or sent a Twitter message, if you were just communicating to the same person in the same room, but using a public electronic communication system, you're caught by the 03 Act. Interesting, unintended consequences of the history of all this. As for retweeting, I'm glad you raised that. The offence is sending the message by electronic communication system. You don't have to be the first sender. If you retweet, you're caught, so it doesn't matter whether you're the person who drafted it in the first place. And that's important for people to appreciate, because people do send on stuff. It also has raised this question, which we had to look at. In order to defeat very racist material on social media, some people deliberately retweet grossly racist stuff to draw attention to it so that people will do something about it. And where does that leave you with the criminal law? Because they've undoubtedly committed the offence under the 2003. And that just demonstrates to you that through no fault of Parliament, because simply the timing didn't work, this was not constructed with the idea of social media in force. But it does create its own problems in terms of